Welcome to Music from Humans, the show where we dive into the creative minds of today's composers and improvisers. I'm your host, Michael Cook, and today I'm thrilled to introduce Stephen Main, a remarkable composer, conductor, teacher, and multi-instrumentalist whose work spans choral, orchestral, and even film music. Stephen's musical journey began in New York City, where he sang as a choir boy at St. Thomas Church. Stephen, a recipient of the John Ness Beck Award, now serves as music director at Piedmont Community Church in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he leads a dynamic music program and continues to compose pieces known for their emotional depth, intricate harmonies, and lyrical beauty. In this episode, we'll explore Stephen's unique approach to blending sacred and secular music, as well as his passion for improvisation, a core part of his creative process. From his live improvisations in church services to his insights in how this practice has influenced the Western classical tradition. Stephen's perspective is sure to offer a fresh and inspiring take on music making. Can one instrument be the foundation of Western music? We'll dive into that question as Stephen shares his thoughts on the most important instrument to Western music and its lasting influence on generations of composers and musicians. So sit back and join us as we explore the fascinating intersection of composition and improvisation and music philosophy with Stephen Main. Well, Stephen, so glad you could come and join me on Music from Humans.
Thank you, Michael. Very glad to be here.
You know, you came up on a short I did about who's your favorite composer, and the composer I was talking to said you. So that's why I had to come and interview you.
Well, you can't buy publicity like that.
This is true. I didn't know a ton about you until my friend introduced me to your music. You have written a lot of film scores and seen a lot of trailers of a lot of your films you've worked on. More recently, you are more involved in writing choir music and religious music for some of the church. But then I found one of the things that we have in common, and I don't know, is this just a universal thing with composers? You're a big multi-instrumentalist. I mean, you play organ and harp and bass and piano.
Violin was my starting instrument. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just all over the place, which, again, I love. I'm a little bit the same way, trying to limit myself mostly to woodwinds, but
I know that about you. Yep.
With some of the church music that you've written, I know you're the pastor of music or something. What is it? Was the right title there?
Actually, the title is minister of music. It can mean all kinds of things. Basically, the older words a century ago would have been organist and choir director at Piedmont Community Church. Right. So I oversee the music program and all of that.
Yes, very cool. And you've presented a lot of your own compositions there. Not too long ago, there was a choir and orchestra piece that you did at your church. You do big works at church plus organ type of work with the improvisation. Out-of-box music was improvised to a degree, or written in a manner to where it's sort of just a structure, framework, and then infrared all the fun stuff. I mean, we get the musicologist version these days where they write everything out, but that wasn't how Bach originally wrote it. It was very, very improvisation. And through our earlier chats, found that you're a little bit kindred spirit like me, and you really like to use improvisation as part of your compositional technique.
Definitely, yes.
So I'd love to dive into how you work with improvisation in your music.
Well, sure. And, it's funny. One of the things that sometimes I tell if I play an organ recital, and I like to talk to the audience in between and sort of, tell them what I'm about to play or what the significance is. One of the things that I've come to say more and more now, the history of Western music is the history of organists improvising at the organ. And I've thought very carefully through each one of those words. What I mean by that is that a lot of people don't know this, that when they think of famous composers, they think maybe Bach and Handel. And it's true, those guys were organists. But so is everybody else. It's amazing how many of the composers we take as sort of foundational to the Western canon were also had a church gig. ones you may not know about. Beethoven had a church job at one point. Mozart had a church job. Schubert played the organ. It's incredible how Brahms, how many of these guys played the organ. And that's important to know. It's also important to know that organists, because organs don't go anywhere because they're too big and they're too heavy, they tend to attract people who aren't itinerant musicians, which was a major category in music history, right? If you were a good trumpet player, you went from town to town and you plied your craft, or you were a good lutenist and that's what you did. But if you're a good organist, you didn't tend to go from town to town. You tended to go where the instruments were. And so those people who had those jobs, they tended to sort of establish themselves as the circle of musicianship and music making, the sort of center of it in that particular area or region. That was certainly true of Bach and true of many of the others as well. And they had a huge influence on generations of students. So all of the composers that were taught by them were absolutely taught by an organist. And the last thing I always want to point out to people is that this may get a little bit into the weeds, but your listeners are into the weeds. So, Western music, the basic Western music is that we've got a melody on the top, right? And we've got a bass line on the bottom. And we've got stuff in the middle. And you put it all together and you get Western music, right? And that's true even if you're classical or even if you're sort of, you're a rock band, right? You've got lead guitar, rhythm guitar, and bass. So that structure has maintained itself for centuries. That is literally what an organist's body does when they're interfacing with their instrument. You got one hand up here playing a melody on one keyboard or manual. You've got your feet down on the bottom, which I can't see on the camera here, playing the pedals down there. And you've got the middle hand doing the stuff in the middle, right? The center of the Oreo cookie there doing the harmony. That's how we think of music. And there are a lot of other ways to think about music, but that's been reinforced over and over again by these generations of composition teachers who happen to be organists. Even the way we go in orchestration from, let's move to the woodwind choir or the brass choir. That's literally what an organist does with their hands. They go from one keyboard to another. So it dawned on me years ago that it's important to know. I mean, you can write music and not be an organist. You can be a lot of things. But it's important to at least know what organists and how organists were thinking, because that's a big clue into not just their own music, but how Western music has sort of been taught for a long time. Because it's always been taught by organists, or almost always has been taught by organists. That's just a really good thing to know. The other thing is that organs, it's true that people wrote preludes and fugues and things like that, which were, and you made a good distinction there, were thought out compositions by, Bach or somebody like that. Mendelssohn wrote a lot of them too. But the bread and butter of what most organists do, including me on a Sunday morning, is you improvise. You improvise for all kinds of situations, right? You improvise before church begins. You play as people are coming in and sitting down. Traditionally, and even today, organists would just make it up. That's certainly true in history. And it's worth saying that in classical music, we had a huge tradition of improvisation that went on for hundreds of years. Every time a violinist comes up to the cadenza in a violin concerto, nowadays they tend to play written out ones that are written out by famous writers or arrangers and all that. And those are beautiful. But back in the day, that was supposed to be the moment when the classical musician would just let her rip.
Yeah.
And would improvise based on all the stuff they were hearing, right? We tend not to do that today, and it's kind of a shame. So I've told a lot of students, the only two places where musicians these days really still improvise and audiences expect it is, of course, jazz, right? My sisters and brothers in the jazz world do it all the time, and organists. They're it, right? If you go to Europe, you'll go into a cathedral there. What the music you're hearing at the end, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be some organist just let it rip. And they're basing it on something. They're basing it on the tunes that the people sang that day or something like that, but it's improv. So I feel like with organ, and also in the jazz world, but they're really well established with that tradition. But in the organ world, we're sort of upholding still the last remnants of that expectation that classical musicians would improvise just as a matter of course. So one of the things I try to tell students is let's increase that tradition, right? Even if you play piano and you're not just a church organist, let's bring this back into the fray. And the last thing I'll say relating to film scoring was that I remember when I was beginning to think about writing film music, and it occurred to me, wow, film music and church music are totally related. And a lot of people have no idea what that means, because both film music and church music The idea is that you're creating an atmosphere. You're not the main point of why people are there in both cases. But without what you're doing, without your contribution, the main point couldn't be gotten across. So the idea is that you're creating this entire atmosphere. You're carefully watching, right? Organists do it all the time. There's a baptism and then, the baby gets dropped into the font. Oh, well, better play something. While they fish the baby out, I got to do something. Or I had this happen to me once, literally. There was a wedding happening and it was supposed to happen at 3:00. We were 3:20, 3:25. Turns out one of the flower girls got locked in the bathroom. So better improvise. So, you make it up and you start weaving in melodies. And so a lot of what organists would do was just based on the fly stuff. And the last thing I'll say is that when movies first came out, silent movies came out, they were being played in pizza parlors and places like that or maybe good movie theaters where they had an organ, but it was the organist who would do it. So there's this poor organist staring at the screen and thinking, okay, somebody got tied to the railroad tracks. I better make up something, something scary there, right? And the hero's in. So I better do something else there, right? And that's just an example of how those two worlds, I think, intersect. So we've talked about many worlds. But anyway, improv is everywhere. And I sort of want to bring it back for more classical musicians.
See, this is where we definitely also gel, because that's also a big piece of in my music and in my belief is to bring back those improvisational aspects of the performers. I almost feel it's criminal that people play cadenzas that they didn't write themselves or didn't just make up on the spot, because that's what it was for years and years and years, and it's only modern times composers started to enforce their will or other people did, oh, here's your cadenza, you play what I'm telling you. And it's like, let the musician sign. It's a solo, concerto is a soloist piece, so let the soloist be there. Pull your ego out of it. Let them make up their own part of the music.
And Michael, I want to jump in there because it's worth saying that over and over again to modern musicians and to our students and all of that we take for granted. If I go, everybody knows what that is, right? The Beethoven. But nobody in Beethoven's day would have been able to call up musical trivia like that at a moment's notice because there were no CDs. There were no recordings everywhere. There was no YouTube. Sometimes when students play, a Mozart piano sonata and there are a lot of repeats, right? Because you were never going to hear this thing again. And composers knew that. Another thing that people don't realize is that nowadays we think of a classical concert as you're going to go and you're going to sit there and somebody's going to play music by lots of dead people. But that wasn't true in history. And in fact, I think for audiences somewhere in the middle of 17-something or 18-something, whether you were in a church, a concert hall, or a tavern, you expected that the music you were hearing was probably being played live by the person who wrote it. It would have made no sense. Why would you pay your dollars and go hear music by dead people? It would have made no sense at all. The whole fun was about watching somebody on their instrument, right, play their axe and to give you their musical conception. Even if it was classical, even if you were Bach presenting a cantata, Bach was at the harpsichord directing. So this idea, this once removed idea that we're all going to sort of sit there with folded hands, not that there's anything wrong with beautiful Schubert, but listening to music by dead people, Schubert wouldn't have understood that, right? That wouldn't have been his association with it either. So that's absolutely worth repeating.
Yeah, and it's why my orchestra, we founded my orchestra, because that's exactly what it's about. We play living composers in the Bay Area. A lot of times it'll be the only time you'll hear it, and that composer most of the time is in the orchestra playing that music as well. And if not, he's sitting in the audience right there live at that point in time, because it was a living, breathing medium, not a history lesson.
1,000%. Right. Correct.
I am so with you on that. I think my personal views is with the struggles that classical music has, being, say, maybe 3% of people who listen to music are listening to classical music, pretty small percentage. I think part of that is our own demise of brand new living composer.
That's right.
And hey, maybe you don't like his piece. That's all right. Tomorrow there'll be someone new, and maybe you'll like his.
That's right.
Kind of like listening to the radio.
Yep.
You're going to take a little risk here and there, but the excitement of hearing something brand new and that you might not get the chance to hear again.
That's right. And if there's any improv in there, that just doubles it, because then not only has the audience not heard it, neither has the improviser heard it, right? Officially, we're all going to hear about this together at the same moment. We'll find out whether it flops or not. And I find that exciting and exhilarating, within bounds of reason. You don't want to watch somebody totally scotch themselves, but it's fun. And that happens too. But it's fun watching it unfold and knowing, wow, this person hasn't heard it either, right? They don't know what it's fully going to do. And so that's definitely part of the excitement.
Yes, I am so connected with you in this. I'm certainly hoping more people, composers also can get into this type of thing, and glad that you teach all this to your students, as we can get more people on this side of that fence.
Yep.
Again, with all this great insight on these, on the organ and the history of that. So how do you integrate improvisation into your composition?
Sure.
Is it strictly that you improvise and then write it down? Or do you actually leave open sections for musicians to improvise? How do you actually work with improvisation?
Sure. And so, when I think about, it's true that a lot of compositions for anybody, I think they get a start. I think this is true for whatever instrument you play. They get to start with a musician sitting down and noodling away and having fun quietly on their instrument, sitting there in your bedroom, just playing your saxophone, and, oh, that's a cool little lick. Hey, that sounds great. And then you play a little long. And I'm a big believer in allowing what I call my students dream time with your instrument. And in fact, one of the little, pet peeves I have about the modern world is that we're so incredibly overfocused and overscheduled, that I sometimes worry that younger musicians don't have the benefit of what I had growing up, where, no smartphones, no internet, no nothing. So you sat around a lot and you just tried out little things on the piano. And did you waste time? Sure, probably. But you were in that dream time where you were learning incalculably important things about your instrument and how you interface with it, and, how it felt emotionally to play it. That stuff's worth its weight in gold. So I think that, do compositions start with sort of, I'm going to sit down and improvise now? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But I definitely think the compositions grow out of that sort of rich earth of all the hours that any one of us spends with whatever your chosen instrument is, right? Just sort of getting to know it, getting to know how it works. So definitely in that way. Having said that, I sort of divide the world of improvisation, or the skill of it, into two immediate families. And I'm very aware when I'm doing the one or the other. The first kind is where you, the player or the improviser, and usually this is almost always when you're the one-man band. You're doing your thing, right? So you're playing typically a polyphonic instrument, right? Meaning an instrument that can have both melody and harmony, that kind of thing. So those would be any kind of keyboard, organs, pianos, harps, guitars. It's probably not going to be as much if you're a solo clarinetist, right? If you're solo clarinetist, you can certainly improvise, but then you're going to have to do other things to make your improv work. And there's some brilliant ones out there. But that first kind is when you're sort of setting the structure for an improv yourself. And then you can kind of gate the improv. You can establish the tempo. You can establish how quickly the chord changes go by. That's one kind. The other kind, which is much more shared in the world of jazz, is where there's a bunch of people improvising together. And therefore, to avoid complete chaos, you have to have at least some sort of implicit understanding or agreement that we're going to follow some sort of plan here. Typically, the plan will be the tune itself that you're improvising on, right? So if everybody gets the chart for Stella by Starlight, then, you play one whole verse through, and then each of the instruments gets, an 8-bar phrase or something like that. And then everybody comes in at the end and they do that. Everybody's improvising there, but they're improvising on an agreed upon chord sequence ahead of time. And in that case, your improv has more to do, I think, with knowing your chords on your instrument, right? So if I have, if the chord chart there in Stella by Starlight is a C minor 7, you better know your little arpeggios, and that's just sort of knowing your own instrument and knowing it in different keys. If you're doing improv on your own, even if you're doing free improvisation where you're literally just making things up, I still tell students you got to have some sort of plan. I think that the improviser's great dreaded fear, the pitfall that all improvisers want to avoid, is what I call the one damn thing after another syndrome. You can tell it when an improviser is in distress. For some reason, I don't know, it's just not working that day. And they're starting to, we've all been there, they're starting to throw things up on the wall to see what sticks. And it's a terrible way to live. It's a bad place to be. And so one of the first things I tell people is fall back on your structure. So if you've got a jazz tune everybody's working on, the structure's there for you. So that kind of checks that box. You don't have to worry about it. If you're making your own thing up and you want to sit down, let's say you're among friends, you're a pianist, and you want to just make a little quiet improv for them. I had an old teacher who said, the worst place to start any music composition is with the first note. It's great advice. And what he meant by that is musicians' tendency, if someone says, hey, play something for us. Oh, okay. You sit down and you start that kind of anxious noodling around, you know. I have no idea what I'm going to do, right? Bad place to start. So even when they say, hey, play something for us, right? My best advice is say, oh, go get yourself a glass of wine. Meanwhile, start thinking. You know, you're going to start thinking of your structure that you're going to play for them. Have some structures ahead of time. This is the second piece of advice, right? Have some structures ahead of time that you know you can fall back on. Have some tricks. Have some little things that you've done before that you know work. Every improviser has their favorite key that they like to improvise on. E flat major is a great key for a lot of reasons. You know, people have different ones. Often it's based on the repertory that your particular chosen instrument often plays in. So, hey, that's the one that you know. You sort of make decisions ahead of time, and then you establish the structure. But either way, the structure has to win. So having said that, I then, to answer your question about how does it inform compositional technique, I don't tend to do compositionally a lot of sort of avant-garde kind of music. I tend to, I'm fundamentally a church musician. That doesn't mean always religious music. What it usually means, though, is that, and this is actually an important distinction, the way I approach music is that every piece of music I write, or even every improv I do, it's going to almost always have some sort of apotheosis moment. I tell my students it's the hockey stick, right? It's going to start here, it's going to build up, and then it's going to have a little denouement at the end. But the point of it's going to be just a little bit before the ending period, and then you're home. So that can take the form of how you build volume, how you go higher in the register, or it can even take the form of the melody that you do. So I often use Happy Birthday as a good example. I don't particularly like the tune Happy Birthday, but it fits the tune well. So if you started, okay, you've just given a lot of information to the audience. Here's the next bit. So that's a very typical Western song form setup, right? You've given me one idea. You've given me, that's A. Now you've given me A prime, right? Same shape, but hey, we notched up the tension just a little bit by going one whole step higher with that last bit. Then comes, of course, the big leap. And now different material. That's the B. And then back to A. It's a great example of the hockey stick reaches in about the 3/4 mark there. And then there's a little retard there, you know? And you can do all this sort of Western things that we all do with music. So even if you're making your own melody up and you're not improvising on Happy Birthday, it doesn't hurt if you're approaching your improv melodically to sort of think about it that way. So what is Happy Birthday doing? It's a great example for many reasons. One of the things that it's doing is that it's creating that shape, right? It's getting higher and higher with each one. The other thing that it's doing is that it's also using little motivic material in there, right? Never underestimate the role that's being played by that little hopping bit there. Because if I was going to improvise, if somebody said, hey, you know, it's my girlfriend's birthday, can you play an improvisation on Happy Birthday for her? We're all going to sit and listen. Okay, so the place to start, remember my teacher, never start with the first note, right? Is to start here. Then you're ready. Right, I've teed it up. So what I did to tee it up was I took that little sort of motivic little bit there, da, 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 and that becomes the machinery that's going to get us moving through this thing, right? So again, following the organist paradigm, right? Decide ahead of time what the melody is. Often it's given, right? For the jazz people, it's always given. Decide what your sort of connective tissue is going to be. That's often a little motive or something that you can pick out there that you can play a few times. The ear recognizes it, but the way you're playing it, the ear knows that that's not the point. That's not why we're here. But that's going to do the servicing. That's going to get us going here. And then the thing starts to write itself. So I find that even for a written out composition, you're still going to fall back on some of those basic kind of fundamentals that you would do in any improvisation that was organized.
So I'm also a really big believer in a motive that is repeatable and repeated enough that people can refer. So even in the most abstract style of music, if you can throw in these motives, it can unabstract it to the point where people can pick up on it, even if it's a crazy avant-garde sounding theme.
Right.
But if it's repeated and brought back, then it there helps with that comfort.
That's right. And that's worth saying there, that repetition is the improviser's. It's your friend, and it's also your greatest pitfall, right? Mm-hmm. It's hugely your friend. And so I'll tell students, one of the things that you need to do if you're wanting to improvise well is learn how to use repetitive material as your best friend. So any kind of ostinato is the thing that you want to sort of get down in your kit bag. This is definitely true if you're playing a polyphonic instrument, right? If you're playing keyboard and you're wanting to do an improvisation on Happy Birthday or something like that, if I'm going to put an F major, right? Again, maybe I'll start with the right hand doing this. Well, now my brain is thinking about what I'm going to do next. So ostinatos are a huge helper because they give a chance to build space, and honestly, to give the improviser a little bit of a sort of get out of jail free card is, oh, what's going to come next? And you're thinking meanwhile about how are you going to set this up? If you're not a polyphonic instrument player, let's say, you play a woodwind instrument or something like that, you still need to know how to do this kind of stuff. So my friend Mads Tolling, who I've had the pleasure of playing with many times, jazz violinist, everybody knows that Mads is amazing when he's carrying the melody and he's improvising on it. And that's all true. But what I've also noticed to my pleasure is when Mads is not carrying the melody, when he's just playing in the background, the guy has licks that he does. He's got ways of playing that are sustaining and keeping the rhythm flowing of the composition, but he doesn't intrude and make it into a solo that we all now have to listen to. That's a huge skill to know how to do. So I tell people, even if you're, a flute player or something like that, definitely know how to improvise on a melody, but also know how to lay out and to sort of help when your friends are doing the melody, know how to provide stuff that essentially does what an ostinato would do, which is to provide motion without actually having to sort of step in and take the primo role.
Is there any other interesting things that you think even composers or other players should do in their improvisational practice?
The only other thing I say is improv practice is it's not a bad idea to give yourself a chord progression, kind of that C minor. Like that. Not a bad idea. Just do that on piano to maybe record it for yourself. And then once it's established, then just learn your instrument. If nothing else, you'll get your arpeggios down. You'll begin to do what you're wanting your audience to do, which is to work with an implicit structure that's there in your mind. And it gets you out of that frightened improviser place where you're like, I'll just throw everything up there and see what sticks, right? So there's actually a way to practice improv, and a lot of people don't know that. They think, you just go out in front of an audience and you kind of make it up. That's a bad way to improvise, and it's also the hardest way to do it. So be easy on yourself. Give yourself a structure. Set a metronome, or I often will just record on your DAW or something, record a little chord change and start playing with it and see what you can come up with. Lower the tempo if you have to, just so you can get to know comfortable with what it's like to work with a structure that's just there to support you. So there are definitely things you can do like that. However, there are also, because musician to musician, we all know you get in trouble sometimes out there.
It's true.
There are actual tricks to know about. Right. And one trick I tell people is the law of repetition doesn't just apply to the things that worked out. It applies to the things that didn't work out. So if you're playing along there, oh, crap, you just made that mistake. Well, then you better come right back to it. I mean, I know you didn't really save it and it's not that pretty and it's not going to win awards, but at least somebody's out there is going to think, oh, I guess he meant it.
It's a classic jazz thing. You play a wrong note, play it 2 more times.
That's right.
And then move on.
Yeah, exactly. And my old teacher used to say, always remember, son, salvation is a half step away.
Yes.
You hit any note, just push it this way or push it that way. You'll hit something people can work with, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a big thing too, is in real time, realize you're going to make mistakes. Things aren't going to work out. People are unbelievably forgiving. And the fact that they don't know what's coming next is a great thing that you can work with as well. So that's literally a trick to know about. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you milk the mistake, some of my favorite things that happened turned out to be mistakes, but you just kept milking it. It starts to sound really awesome. And then you resolve it in some way. And it's like, wow, that was great. But it was, I missed the note I was trying to hit, but I just stayed with it until it sounded awesome.
And I should say a corollary technique that I teach students also, and it's related to, and I discovered it one day because I was making a mistake, is I call it the technique of Stretto. And if your listeners are musicians, they'll remember maybe if they took a counterpoint class that a Stretto is that thing in a fugue where if the fugue subjects were normally brought 4 bars apart from each other, the first voice would start with the fugue subject and then the second voice would come in. A Stretto is often at the end of the fugue where they come in very, very close. And it's, I think, related to the Italian word for tightening. But the idea is that you're increasing the tension. And what I teach my students is that Stretto as a technique is not just for fugal writing. It's actually something that you can do in the middle of your improvs. It'll create tension without having to kind of add new material. So back to the Happy Birthday as a good example. That little lick, you can use that throughout your composition, right? As you develop, you can go, let's see. So I'm using that shape and I'm putting other chords underneath it, right? And this is not terribly avant-garde stuff. I'm just sort of throwing in standard chords. But you can also, as you want to, you can do sort of the law of Stretto, which puts the tension closer together. So you can go. I'm suddenly piling up there. It's a great way of, number one, giving your brain something to do while you're thinking about the next thing, which is always what the improviser's trying to do, is right, get to that next sense of where am I going? Where's the next chapter heading in whatever I'm doing? It also uses the law of imitation.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, I really appreciate the insights. I very much enjoyed knowing that there's more composers out there with similar philosophies.
Definitely.
Always excites me that, as composers, we tend to be in our little room writing our music and you're self-contained and you don't hear about other folks. And so it's always good when you're able to group together and find that, oh yeah, okay, more than just me thinks that.
It's more than just me thinks that.
Very reassuring.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right.
So I appreciate you the time coming out and talking with me, and hope to be able to catch some of your music out there since you're local, and maybe we can find good ways of collaborating in the future.
I'd love to.
Thanks a lot, Stephen.
Thanks, Michael. All right, talk soon.